All right, thank you for staying with us. Well, the conversation continues, but another angle to it now. A report by BudgIT's says that Nigeria government spent 3.34 trillion naira servicing debt in 2020. Well, this represents 97.6% of the 3.42 trillion naira available revenue. The BudgIT's 2020 budget implementation analysis shows that a total of 10 trillion naira of the budget expenditure was spent as of December 31st, 2020. According to the report, debt servicing obligations gulped 97% of Nigeria's government total revenue in 2020, as total expenditure stood at 10.01 trillion naira, indicating that nearly all federal government salaries, overheads, and capital expenditure were financed with loans and CBN support. In 2020, FG projected a total revenue of 5.37 trillion naira. However, the actual total revenue eventually stood at 3.42 trillion naira. This represents a 63.71% revenue performance. Well, I introduced him earlier. He's live in the studio. He's the head research and policy advisory at BudgIT, Mr. Bel Akani. Mr. Akani, it's good to see you on the show today.
Yeah, good afternoon, Tolu. It's good to see you too.
Yes, just like I reeled out in my introduction, spending 3.34 trillion naira to service debt. This is worrisome from a total revenue of 3.42 trillion in 2020. Can you take us through like an overview of this report?
Okay. Thank you very much, Tolu, for that. So let me start from the beginning. Typically, at the beginning of every year, the government projects what it intends to spend for the year, and it estimates what it will potentially get as its revenue. So for the year 2020, it estimated that it will get about 5.37 trillion. That's excluding monies from GOEs and the like, and project-tied loans. However, in reality, it did not make that much money. And what that means is, once you make your projections that you're going to make this amount of revenue, and you give your projections for your total expenditure, you typically have what would refer to as a surplus or a deficit. In Nigeria's case, after estimating its revenue, it was supposed to get a deficit of about 4.97 trillion. Unfortunately, by the end of the year, December 2020, what we found was that the deficit for the federal government was about 6.59 trillion, and this is largely because there was a shortfall in what was projected as the revenue. Now, if you read the report, I know you've looked through it. Nigerians would see that the government projected to get about 5.37 trillion, but what came in, as you mentioned earlier on, is just about 3.42 trillion. So it didn't meet up to the revenue projection. As a result of that, the deficit was wider, as I mentioned, 6.59. So if the deficit were to be 4.97, it means that the government would have to potentially sell some assets or do some borrowings to finance that 4.97. But now that it's about 6.59 trillion, the implication is that the government had to borrow more than what was projected. And if we just stay on the revenue numbers a bit, we would see that the 3.42 trillion that came in, when you put that side by side, what the government spent just on servicing past debts, which came to about 3.34 trillion, you'll see that that wiped out nearly 97.6% of the country's revenue, leaving very little to pay for salaries, to pay for infrastructure. Now, the implication of that is that all the lavish salaries and allowances that all our senators and legislators and House of Rep members, all what they got in 2020 was all borrowed. Same goes for civil service. All what was paid to civil servants as salaries, all that money was borrowed. Every road constructed by the federal government, those monies were borrowed. That's how bad the country's situation is when it comes to managing its revenue inflow versus its expenditure.
That report also, the federal government funded salaries, overhead, and capital expenditure with loans. You know, back to that again. It's really, really worrisome when one looks at this. How long do you think can we sustain this trend as we move on?
So actually, it's very unsustainable.
Subsidies somewhere. We're also talking about that, like 150 billion every month.
And the thing with subsidy is, as the crude oil price continues to rise, the total subsidy bill will shoot up. So there is that problem on the side that will continue to encroach into the little revenue that the government is making. But even beyond that, there is still the problem of MDAs collecting revenues and not remitting it to the federal government, and then forcing the federal government to go forth and borrow. So you have some sort of a government within a government. If you look at the data, for example, for revenue inflows, you would see that stamp duties brought in 0 for the budget implementation. But in reality, throughout the year 2020, we find that the government was actually collecting stamp duties. So the question is, why wasn't that money available for spending through the budget? And it's not, the problem is not just with the stamp duties, it also affects several other MDAs. If you follow the news for about 2 weeks ago, the Fiscal Responsibility Commission chairman actually announced that about 32 MDAs are withholding 1.2 trillion naira in revenue from the federal government. So that's money that would have helped prevent the government from going to borrow further. And once you borrow more, you are piling up more debts for the future generations of Nigerians to pay off, because the current debts we're servicing are loans that have been taken over the past 10, 15 years. And that's the price we are paying currently. So once you have a situation where MDAs are withholding revenue, they are not releasing this to the government, that's something that certainly the government needs to check. And the Fiscal Responsibility Commission put the figure at just 1.2, but if you put that side by side by what the Finance Committee of the Senate put out, the Finance Committee actually said the figure is as high as about 3 trillion over the past few years that MDAs are not remitting to the government. So that's something that the government needs to clamp down on. I don't think it's a normal situation where we have the government coming to lament that some of its MDAs, headed by people who are basically political appointees of the president, are not remitting revenue to the government. It's basically preposterous. It's something that it shouldn't even be happening, because you appointed these people. If they are withholding as much as 1.2 trillion, you should be able to call them to order to remit this amount of money for budget implementation. Because once this is not available, you do not have enough money for service delivery. And if you look at 2020, you would see that service delivery, especially for vulnerable people, was affected significantly in 2020. If I take the case for pensions alone, the government had projected to pay retired workers pensions and their gratuity of over 530 billion. But when we looked at the data for what it eventually paid, it was in the range of over about 350 billion. So what that means is that some pensioners were not able to get their pension as at when due during the COVID-19 pandemic. And these were some of the most vulnerable people who are currently out of work. They've retired and they depend on some of these pensions to survive. And they were starved of funds that they have worked for the last 60 years or more of their lives. And then you have on the side some MDs withholding monies that would have been very instrumental in sorting these people out and paying them their required pension. Another thing, another critical aspect of service delivery that can be significantly affected when we have this type of scenario, is health. Granted, the government spends significant amount of money on some aspects of health, but there is the Basic Healthcare Provision Fund, for which the government is supposed to devote some funding. Yeah. And when we looked at the records, we saw that for 2020, if you go to, I think that's for page 38 of the Q4 implementation report, you'll see the BHCPF, what was released to it was just 0. And this is the funding that is supposed to cater to primary healthcare centers that are the closest to the people at the grassroots. Nigeria has more than 27,000 primary healthcare centers owned by the government across the country. And they need money from the federal government to run. They need money from state governments to run. They need money from the local governments to operate efficiently, to take care of pregnant women, to take care of sick people, to immunize the children. But when we have a situation that just 0 was disbursed to that, it's something that Nigerians should worry about, and it's something that advocates, especially in the health sector, need to speak up about and ensure that something similar is not happening in 2021 as it concerns the BHCPF, so that we don't compromise service delivery, especially as it concerns healthcare.
with what we even saw last year with COVID-19, I don't think we need to take that for granted. And the Delta variant is what is up now. Well, according to the same report, we see the oil sector still playing a very important role when it comes to revenue generation for government. And this is not what we've been talking about, diversifying our economy. The non-oil sector is still yet to do so very well. So what do you make of all of this, talking about the oil revenue and non-oil sector contribution to the budget spending?
So what I would say is that historically, we have learned that oil prices are volatile, and it's not a safe bet for a country to rest a significant component of its earnings on oil. So it's important that the government urgently diversifies its revenue from just oil. It needs to look at non-oil taxes more critically. But the truth is, you cannot tax what is not prospering. You cannot tax businesses that are dying. So you first and foremost need to create an enabling environment, and then you need to tackle the problem of formalization of companies and businesses in the country. Nigeria has a very large informal sector, and Nigeria has a very large segments for unregistered transactions and businesses. What the government needs to do is to find a way to formalize the industries so that they can accurately trace these businesses and tax them effectively. But before it does that, it first and foremost even needs to build trust among the people. But I'll come to that. But staying on the issue of boosting its non-oil tax revenue, it needs to broaden the tax net. And one of the best ways to do that is to ensure that all micro, small, and medium-scale enterprises are fully registered with the Corporate Affairs Commission, because you can't tax what you don't see. So once you're able to get these MSMEs registered, you might have a chance that you would be able to approach these MSMEs for taxes. We have nearly 40 million of them currently, but if you look at the data from Corporate Affairs Commission, we have just about 3 million registered companies in the country. And part of why that continues to be so is that there is a high barrier for entry. You find a situation where to register a company, you may spend between anything from 15,000 naira to 150,000 naira, depending on the type of company you want to register. So first recommendation, if the government is going to boost its non-oil revenue, is to crash the registration fees for all companies in the country. Rwanda charges 0 registration fee. So if you want to register a business in Rwanda, you basically pay nothing. So now that we are facing a situation that we need to broaden our tax net, especially taxes from corporate income tax, and then taxes for that benefit the state government, which is pay as you earn, we need to broaden that tax net. And the best way to do it is to first and foremost, crash registration fees, bring it down to something close to 0, if possible, for a period of 2 years. You don't need to do it forever. Bring it down to 0 and ensure that as many people as possible are basically registered as formal business entities. That way, you would have visibility on these entities. So that's one of the strongest things I think the government can do. And I know there's been arguments from the government side that it has tried that approach for about 5 months. I think in 2019, where they slashed the registration of business names to about 5,000 naira for companies. But that was done more or less as an election stunt, because if you look at it, as soon as they won the elections, they returned the prices back to the original thing. So if it was possible for them to do that, I think it should be possible now that the country is facing a crisis. And this time it shouldn't just be brought down to 5,000, it should actually be brought down to 0. Because if you do a cost-benefit analysis of what you would gain if you have, even if it's 20 million MSMEs registered versus having a high barrier that's expensive, and most of these small businesses cannot actually afford it. The benefits are actually large if you crash the fees. And there is also some argument that the uptake for the registration, especially for business names, when the government crashed the prices the last time in 2019, was a bit low. But that's largely because that was for business name segment. A lot of Nigerians know that to do proper transactions corporations. You need to have formal entities like maybe a limited liability companies and not just a business name registered. So that wasn't very attractive to a lot of Nigerians. What the government really needs to crash significantly is that aspect for registration of limited liability companies and other real formal entities. So that's one way the government can go if it intends to boost its non-oil tax revenue. And I would also mention that, and I think I alluded to it earlier on, you cannot tax dead companies. You cannot tax companies that don't exist. So the government needs to find a way to mobilize capital for the private sector to be able to fund their businesses, run their operating costs, do their productions, offer different services. And this is not recommending that the government should loan directly to these businesses, because the government itself is essentially broke. What the government can do is to promote interesting and very useful policies like the use of credit scores to assess credit as opposed to using collateral. So if businesses, if the government popularizes or incentivizes the financial institutions to consistently accept more credit scoring for giving businesses credit, that's going to unlock trillions of naira in capital for many of these businesses, and they essentially will be able to thrive better. And when you have businesses that are thriving, you would have more people who you are able to tax. So yes.
Let's wrap up on this note. Capital expenditure also visibly low. If you look at it, 1.6 trillion as against 2.69. How would you assess what has happened with regards to capital projects and with this kind of funding, and what's your entire assessment of the performance of the 2020 budget generally?
Okay. So first and foremost, I would say it's a calamity. What we have seen with the capital project implementation, because it's significantly low if you really want to boost your economy. What the government spent, 1.6 trillion, is a very little amount. But we can see that the government itself was actually cash strapped in the year 2020, so there was a limit to what it could realistically do. So our assessment and recommendation in that respect, especially for capital project implementations, would be going forward in future, the government should prioritize the use of public-private partnerships, PPPs, for implementing much of its capital projects and for implementing, especially in sectors like health, and education. If the government leverages public-private partnerships, we'll find ourselves in a situation where most of the projects that are planned for get executed. Because once you see a scenario where only 1.6 trillion out of the total of what was budgeted for capital was implemented, it means that there were roads that were never built. It means there were schools that were never built. It means that there were hospitals that were planned that were never built, equipment that would save lives that were planned for but were never purchased. So the safe thing the government can do now that it's facing dwindling revenue is to ensure that it is able to leverage private sector capital. And in addition to leveraging private sector capital, I would wrap up by saying the government also needs to block the leakages in capital expenditure spending. I think previously we had discussed our observations, especially from the 2021 capital budget, where we saw several duplicated projects and several inflated projects with inflated costs. Those are things that the government needs to clamp down on significantly, so that we can ensure that what is written on paper is actually translating to that exact amount of infrastructure on the ground. So the government needs to close down the loopholes, end the practice of duplicated projects, introduce beneficial ownership transparency, because we found ourselves in a situation where a lot of the politically exposed persons, heads of different agencies, end up awarding some of these contracts to themselves and to people who are not competent enough to execute them. But there is limited visibility on those people who are committing this type of heinous crime, because there isn't any use of beneficial ownership transparency data in the procurement process. So the government is essentially blind to detect those sort of infractions when they occur. So the government needs to block these leakages, and also I would say they need to step up their efforts to close the trust deficit with the citizens. Right now, the citizens don't trust the government because the government has commenced several efforts to fight corruption, but we are not seeing, or citizens are not seeing, the visible impact of the so-called war on corruption. If you take NDDC as an example, the government, I think they were supposed to conclude a probe of the NDDC last year, but we found out that they have not even concluded that probe and no one has been prosecuted. What we even observed was a situation where even while that probe was going on, those they put in charge to oversee the probe, some of them were involved in mismanaging the funds, especially COVID-19 funds. We saw a scenario where about 3 billion naira was shared amongst different staffs and senior management as COVID-19 allowances, where when you have people in the Niger Delta who are suffering from real deprivations, who should have received these amounts of money. So the government needs to put back up its talk with action. We need to see concrete evidence that the government is actually closing these loopholes beyond just announcing it on paper. Just in December here, we had a situation where monies meant for payments to rural women who were deprived of maybe access to their farms as a result of lockdowns. So a lot of funding from conditional cash transfers, some of them made their ways to private pockets. We found that at least in December, 1.1 billion naira was paid to the private accounts of about 17 people. And this is money that was ordinarily meant for thousands of women in the northern and some southern parts of the country. So those are things that should not be happening because they erode the quality of trust that citizens have in the government and its program.
It's a good way to leave it. Head Research and Policy Advisory at Budget, Mr. Bel Akani. Thank you very much for making sense of this very interesting report.
Thank you very much.
It's always a pleasure having you.